Hey, it's Charlie from Charlie Reads and Reviews, and it's Saturday. Not exactly Sunday, but I need to do some editing, so I'm recording this a little bit early. I'm also doing a wrap up over the past 2 weeks because I didn't edit the video from last week, and I've only read one book so far this week. So let's get into it. The first book that I finished was a book called Grass. It's a graphic novel. I read this on Scribed by Gumsuk Chendri Kim. And in this graphic novel, we follow the life of a grandmother, Halmoni, who is a survivor of the six slave camps set up in China during the occupation of Korea by Japan, and in particular over the Sino-Japanese War, as well as World War II. Throughout this story, we see how young girls and young women are kidnapped, doing rather ordinary things like walking around, are kidnapped and taken to China. We also see aspects that make them a lot more vulnerable, such as the abject poverty um, spread throughout Korea due to the occupation of Korea by Japan. And they also touch on the rape of Nanjing, which, if you have read The Poppy War, and there's a specific, really harrowing scene of a complete destruction of a city and of the women and children who were violently attacked sexually. Um, that is inspired by a real life experience that happened in Nanjing, also known as the rape of Nanjing. So she does cover that in this book. I think she did a phenomenal job of representing some really traumatic and painful experiences in an honorable way for these women, in a non gratuitous way, which made the book quite, and when I say enjoyable, it's obviously not enjoyable in terms of what happens to the women in the story, but it was an easy read, and I think I finished it in just a couple of hours, one evening. Thoroughly enjoyed it, and it gets 5 halos. I recommend this if you don't know much about the comfort women from South Korea, if you don't know much about Korean history. I think this would be a great place to start your journey. I think women are never really featured enough in history. It tends to always be from the perspective of a male purview. And so I love recommending books that show how women were oftentimes the biggest victims in wars and conflict, and sometimes even the biggest heroes. Right, then the next book that I finished was this gorgeous, beautiful book, Unbury Our Dead with Song by Mukoma Wangugi, who is the son of the very famous Ngugi wa Thiong'o. He is a Kenyan author based in the US, and in this book, published by Cassava Republic, I really enjoy all of the books that I've read so far that they've published, and certainly I have like this sense that anytime somebody suggests a book and the publisher's cassava, I know I'm going to enjoy it. I know it's going to be brilliant. This is my best read of 2022 so far. It's an absolutely beautifully written book, really easy to read. I got into it right from the get go. I know some people struggled with the first couple of chapters, which is centered around a contest for these four Ethiopian artists who are competing to be labeled the best Tizita artist. And in essence, that's the premise of the story. There's a Kenyan journalist who's come here to write about it, and he's so enthralled by this concept of the Tizita and the concert. So nobody wins. And they say, come back in a month, go home and come back. So he follows them all through to Ethiopia and learns more about the artist as well as a Tizita. And if you're wondering what is a Tizita, in essence, a Tizita is an Ethiopian Eritrean folk song that has no set lyrics, no set melody, but it is on the musician to truly harness the essence of what a tizita is. And if you have the capability to move someone's soul, to move within them emotions such as pain and love and joy and hope and suffering all at the same time, you have created a beautiful tizita. It is a song that can bring the dead back to life. It is a song that reminds us of our purpose as the human race. I loved this book, and I could go on and on and on about it, but I'm not going to. But 5 halos for it, I would give it more if I could. Then the next book that I finished was an audiobook. This was called Unseen by Reggie Yates, who is a Ghanaian British um, film producer, former child actor, journalist, and a whole bunch, just a general media person. And I read this book as part of the Read Guardian Challenge, which is between the 1st and 7th of March. I really, however, struggled with this, and it ended up with a 3 Halo rating for me because I think it was a well told story. I think his narration was really good, but I found it quite boring at times. And I think the reason for this is that I think you would enjoy this if you were a film and media student or someone in the industry trying to improve on your skills, because in essence it's about the unseen or the behind the scenes aspects of creating documentaries, and he is talking specifically about the documentaries that he was a part of. Whilst there were some interesting facts that I learned about Russia and about pastors in South Africa, it just didn't move me enough. I think I would have enjoyed actually just watching the documentaries themselves. The behind the scenes aspects was just not for me. I actually think that he chose the wrong medium for this. I think he should have just made a docu-series. I think that would have just elevated this experience a whole lot more for myself and for anyone else who read this book. Then the next book that I finished was also another audiobook, and this was Kim Ji-young, born 1982, by Cho Namju. This covered the prompt from Koreadathon of a book translated from Korean as well as a book suggested by a Korean celebrity. I really enjoyed this. It was a very short listen. I listened to this inscribed, I think it was like a 3.5 hour audio. Absolutely loved it. In the story, it's written in a very witty, dry manner, akin to Convenience Store Woman, if you've ever read that. And except for this perspective is that of patriarchy and its impact of women, and in particular wives and mothers and daughters. And we follow the life of Kim Ji-young from her birth all the way to modern times, where she is married with 2 children. She's just given birth to a second child, is suffering from postpartum depression when she finds out that a good friend of hers has passed away, giving birth to her second child. And that kind of segues us into just going through her memory and her life, and we see the impact of patriarchy not only on herself, but on her grandmothers, her mother, other girl children around her as she grows up, her colleagues at work. And whilst it does show us the improvements that have happened with women getting more and more rights over time, it also shows just how insidious and how ingrained patriarchy is in our society, that no matter how much we say let's give women equal rights, equal pay, etc., if we don't start to change it at our mental state and how we treat girl children and boy children differently fundamentally, even within your own family homes, that this is something that is here to stay for a long time. Thoroughly enjoyed this. Definitely going to get a physical version of this. Gave it 4.5 halos. Then the next book that I finished was a ebook, digital book, and this was the group book for the Koreadathon, and this was Winter in Sokcho by Elissa Shua Dusapin. And this is a book that covered the prompt of read the group book and also read a Korean book that won an award. In this story, we follow a young woman who is a receptionist at a guest house in Sokcho. She is biracial but has raised her whole life in Korea. Her father was French, but she didn't know him. And she, in an effort to find her identity, she has studied French literature, and she's learned how to speak French on top of speaking English. So in this guest house, a French tourist walks in, and she finds herself drawn towards him, most likely because he's French, and unintentionally becomes his guide around Sokcho. So Sokcho is a tourist town on the west coast of South Korea, about 60 kilometers away from the border with North Korea, or rather from the demilitarized zone, which is shared by North and South Korea. And throughout this story, because the French tourist is a graphic novelist looking for inspiration for his current book that he is putting together, she shows him her perspective of Sokcho, but she also gets to see Sokcho from his perspective. A small town that usually gets a lot of visitors coming through around summer times, locals because a very famous K-drama was filmed there, and internationals because of the close proximity to the DMZ. Really enjoyed it, very quick read, quite quirky and dry. Again, akin to the Convenience Store Woman and Kim Ji-young, born in 1982-esque type of vibe. And I gave it 4 halos. Then the next book that I finished was Crying in H Mart. I listened to this one on Scribed as well. This covered the prompt of read a book featuring a Korean in diaspora. And in this memoir, it is about Michelle Zona, who is an American musician. Her mother was Korean and her father Caucasian, and she is grieving the loss of her mother, who's recently passed to cancer. Throughout this really honest and raw memoir, she talks about her whole life and her, at sometimes, tumultuous relationship with her mother, and about her fears upon losing her mother that it makes her less Korean, and her journey to finding and reconnecting with the Korean aspects of her, which in a way brings her mother back to life or keeps her mother alive with her. Beautifully written book, absolutely an enjoyable memoir. And I think something that if you yourself are grieving and losing someone, especially if you've lost that person to cancer, that this read could be quite cathartic. I would give it 5 halos, but in principle, I don't give memoirs 5 halos, but 4.5 halos. Definitely one of the top memoirs I've ever read, and I'm definitely going to get a physical version of it. All right, so those are all the books that I read between the 7th and the 13th of March, and then between the 8th and today's the 19th, no, 8th, Charlie, 14th and the 19th of March, I've read only one book. I've had a really slow read at that, and that is Small Country by Gaia Fei. It's a historical fiction book which reads like a memoir, and it's centered around from the perspective of a young boy, Gabriel or Gabby, who is a biracial boy born and raised in Burundi. His mother's Rwandese. She was a refugee from Rwanda from I think it was the 1963-64 genocide, and has lived in Burundi since then for the rest of her life, and his father, who is French. And throughout the story, we learn about the different incidents in his short time. He's only about 11 when the Rwandan genocide of 1994 occur. And so we see the life of an expat, because they are in a privileged position, the life of an expat living in Burundi, the challenges of being a refugee in another country, in a space that is very similar, because there are Hutus and Tutsis in Burundi as well, very similar to you, but feeling like an outsider, the xenophobia that you deal with, and at times literally being able to look across a lake and see your home country that you are unable to return to. It highlights just the different ways in which this sense of otherness grows and becomes insidious. And it takes it predominantly from the Burundi perspective, like the different civil wars that happened and the impact of the genocide in Rwanda on Burundi, which looks very different to that, I would assume, of being within Rwanda, and touches on a lot of historical things that I was not aware of. It certainly makes me want to go out and read more books about the genocide in Rwanda, and over a period of time. So I've got a couple of books that I'm planning to read. So one of them is Our Lady of the Nile by Scholastic Mukasonga, which starts about 15 years before the 1994 genocide, as well as Cockroaches by Scholastic Mukasonga, which is a memoir. That one's only arriving on the 1st of April, so I'll only get to read it then. I was meant to read this book as well as Cockroaches in conjunction for the Lit Avengers Salon discussion, which is happening next week, Saturday, but I'm unfortunately not able to attend it. But I'm very grateful to have read this book, and I cannot wait to get to Cockroaches as well as Our Lady of the Nile. I gave this rating 4.5 halos. Absolutely enjoyed it, as you can see. Really, really beautiful book. Really short, easy to read, but painful in terms of the content. Obviously not gratuitous, even though violence is featured, because it is from a 10 to 11-year-old boy's perspective, but painful at the same time. And so those are all the books that I have read in the past 2 weeks. I've had a very good 2 weeks of reading, barring the one book. And so I'm now excited to get into The First Woman by Jennifer Nansubuga Makumbi. We're reading this for the April discussion for Overbooked Essay, which we'll also be discussing alongside So Long a Letter. And I have started to reread Pachinko. I started listening to it on my walk this morning, but I definitely, once I'm finished with First Woman, want to pick up the physical and read it. It's just a beautifully written book, and I'm reading this in preparation for its adaptation onto a TV series that is premiering on the 25th of March. Okay, so that's me. Happy Saturday and happy long weekend if you're in South Africa.